Hello and welcome to the Week in Parliament. So it's Parliament, not the Prime Minister, who'll start the process to exit the EU. That's what the High Court says.
It's all about Parliament's sovereignty.
This judgment raises important and complex matters of law.
Speculation mounts we could even be heading for a May election. That's the month, not the person. Talking of national elections, what do we make of that contest over the pond?
Partisan loyalty is so strong, you could put, anything with a pulse on the Democratic or Republican ticket, and 40% of the country would vote for them.
And back to Blighty, it's a battle over benefits at Prime Minister's questions.
It is time that we ended this institutionalised barbarity against often very vulnerable people.
I have to say to him that the Labour Party is drifting away from the views of Labour voters.
But first, victory for Parliament or defeat for the people? Interpreting the High Court judgment that went against Theresa May's intended route for taking Britain out of the EU might well depend if you're a Brexiteer or a Remainer. 3 judges ruled that parliamentary approval is required to trigger that famous Article 50, starting the Brexit process. It can't just be left to the Prime Minister. Campaigners on the parliamentary side have won this first round, but now the case will go to all 11 judges of the UK Supreme Court. The news from the High Court came as MPs were discussing trade deals once Britain has left the EU.
In order to do a bilateral trade deal, we need to be out of the European Union. Does he therefore deplore, as I do, the High Court's decision this morning to rule against the government and say that the will of the people in the EU referendum on the 23rd is still subject to parliamentary approval?
Mr. Speaker, the government is disappointed by the court's judgment. The country voted to leave the European Union in a referendum approved by Act of Parliament. The government is determined to respect the result of the referendum. This judgment raises important and complex matters of law.
On the subject of debating and voting on essential trade matters, isn't it essential now that the government give way to the courts and allow Parliament to be sovereign and to debate and vote on the issue of Article 50?
The truth is that this Parliament is, always has been and always will be sovereign. So Parliament could overcome any trade deal it wanted. The question we have to ask ourselves is whether Parliament should resist the will of the people.
Could I ask him, on behalf of the government, please to look at the learned judge's ruling and understand that it's not about a rerun of the arguments about the EU referendum. It's all about Parliament's sovereignty. And in that event, will the government look at it carefully to decide whether or not, in fact, the learned judges are right, and it's this place that should and indeed will trigger Article 50?
As this is now an ongoing court case, I have nothing further to add to the comments I made earlier.
Will he acknowledge that the vast majority of members in this House are now committed to honouring the decision to leave the EU, but that democracy demands that the terms of our leaving must be subject to the proper advanced scrutiny and consent of this democratically elected House, and not negotiated in secret and smuggled through without the support of this sovereign Parliament?
Mr. Speaker, there will be numerous opportunities for the House to examine and discuss what the government is negotiating. When we are clear about the position we will adopt, then Article 50 will be triggered. But given the nature of the judgment this morning, we will now have to await the government's appeal to the Supreme Court.
And more reaction during questions to the Commons leader.
This is an important, significant ruling which suggests that this House is sovereign on these matters, and as a leader of this House, not just of this government, of this House, he should respect that. And what plans has he therefore got to bring an early vote on these matters to this House?
The court has come to the judgment that it has today, and we will make a further statement, Mr. Speaker, on Monday when the attorney has had the chance to look in detail at the judgment.
David Liddington. Well, 24 hours after those exchanges came news of another resignation from Parliament. The Conservative backbencher and barrister Stephen Phillips said he was quitting the Commons as he disagrees with Theresa May's Brexit strategy. This in spite of the fact that he'd actually campaigned for Brexit. Mr Phillips had given some hint of his disagreements with his leader in recent weeks.
The suggestion that the government will not consult this House and listen to the voices of those who represent the voters of this country is fundamentally undemocratic. It's inimical to the traditions which underpin our Constitution, and in my view it is wrong. But it also runs contrary to the reasons for which I and others voted as we did. I didn't vote leave to see one tyranny which failed to consult this House, in the form of the European Commission, replaced by another, in the form of a government which fails to listen to what this House thinks about its negotiating position.
The High Court ruling has fuelled speculation that the Prime Minister may be tempted to go to the country and launch a general election on us, maybe in the spring. Just 24 hours before the High Court had put a spanner in Mrs May's Brexit plans, it was business as usual when she faced the Labour leader at PMQs. Jeremy Corbyn began his questioning on cuts to benefits by reminding the Prime Minister of her pledge when she entered Downing Street to help families just managing to get by.
However, we now know that these were just empty words, as this government plans to cut work allowances for exactly those families who are just getting by. Isn't it the case that her cuts to universal credit will actually leave millions worse off?
The point about universal credit is making sure that work always pays. As people earn more, as people work more, they earn more. It's right that we don't want to see people just being written off to a life on benefits, that actually we're encouraging people to get into the workplace.
Could I recommend the Prime Minister supports British cinema and takes herself along to a cinema to see a Palme d'Or winning film, I, Daniel Blake? And while she's doing so, perhaps she could take the Work and Pensions Secretary with her, because he described the film as monstrously unfair and then went on to admit that he'd never seen it. So he's obviously got a very fair sense of judgment on this. But I'll tell the Prime Minister what's monstrously unfair. Ex-servicemen like David Clapson dying without food in his home due to the government's sanctions regime. It is time that we ended this institutionalised barbarity against often very vulnerable people.
I have to say to the Right Honourable Gentleman that, of course, it's important that in our welfare system we ensure that those who need the support that the state is giving them through that benefit system are able to access that. But it is also important in our system that those who are paying for it feel that the system is fair to them as well. That is right. That is why we need to have work capability assessments. It's why we need to have sanctions in our system. Now, the Right Honourable Gentleman has a view that there should be no assessments, no sanctions and unlimited welfare. I have to say to him that the Labour Party is drifting away from the views of Labour voters. It's this party that understands working class people.
Then a question on football and poppies.
Has the Prime Minister spotted the ludicrous refusal by FIFA, the Footballing Federation, to let our players wear poppies at the forthcoming Scotland-England game? Will he tell the respective associations that in this country we decide when to wear poppies? And they'll be wearing them at Wembley.
I think the stance that's been taken by FIFA is utterly outrageous. Our football players want to recognise and respect those who have given their lives for our safety and security. I think it is absolutely right that they should be able to do so. I think it's for our football associations, but I think a clear message is going from this House. We want our players to be able to wear those poppies, and I have to say to FIFA that before they start telling us what to do, they jolly well ought to sort their own house out.
Theresa May putting one in the back of the net. From the special relationship of England and Scotland to that other special relationship between the UK and the US, because on Tuesday the people of America will be electing their 44th president. It's been a long and bruising campaign. Is there something we should learn from it for our own elections? Prevailing on Wednesday will be either the Republican Donald Trump or the Democrat Hillary Clinton. British Prime Ministers have enjoyed cordial, not to say cosy, relationships with a great many US presidents over the years, providing us with some memorable photo opportunities. And to discuss the present presidential contest, I'm joined in the studio now by our very own US election panel. Dr. Jacob Parakilas is the assistant head of the US and Americas programme at the Chatham House think tank in London. Dr. Daniel Cato is a lecturer in American politics at Queen Mary University. Gentlemen, welcome to the Week in Parliament. Now, perhaps I can start with you, Daniel Cato. This seems to have been a quite remarkable presidential campaign. Has it been a campaign like no other?
I think there's a historical precedent for it, but I think definitely with the mass media, for example, the first presidential debate had more people watching than actually are citizens in England. So the scope and scale of this campaign is unprecedented, so yeah.
Jacob, quite remarkable campaign.
Yes, I mean, I think you would actually have to go quite a ways back to find something that equaled it in terms of sort of unprecedentedness. You know, I've been looking for a good analogy for Donald Trump. I think Andrew Jackson in the first half of the 19th century is probably the best model.
That's a long way back.
It is.
Now, it seems at the end of this very long campaign that both the parties, Republican and the Democrats, seem to have landed with candidates that their party members are not too keen on. How did it all happen like this?
There was an interesting New York Times article that says only about 9% of Americans actually chose Trump and Clinton. So the way the primary process works and our campaign suggests it's not a majoritarian institution, never has been and never will be. And so I think that's one of the big differences about trying to explain U.S. politics to UK listeners, only because it's a very fragmented process, one in which somebody like Trump can actually win.
But there's a big difference between how it worked on the Democratic side and how it worked on the Republican side, because you had 17 candidates on the Republican side, and Trump sort of made his way through that very contested space and became the nominee against the almost explicit wishes of the party elders. Clinton is the sort of manifestation of the party elders. So you have actually, in a way, these two parties working at completely different strategies and completely different structures to each other.
But the reason, I suppose, for the huge amount of interest around the world, and certainly plenty of it here in Britain, is the candidates. Donald Trump comes across to the average British person as a supremely confident, arrogant man. He's got very, very strong views about himself, and he has no problem in coming out with provocative remarks and extreme remarks. I mean, what makes him so attractive to American citizens that British people find quite a bit of a turn-off?
There's an element of sort of simple anti-establishmentism. I mean, this is somebody who stands for literally everything the establishment is against. I mean, the irony there is he is actually quite an establishment figure. He's, you know, his father was very wealthy. He's part of a sort of New York social set, but he's cast himself as this great figure of opposition to everything that's going wrong and everything that's bad in the world. And that, in and of itself, is a powerful force. But by the same token, I think you could partisan loyalty is so strong, you could put, you know, anything with a pulse on the Democratic or Republican ticket, and 40% of the country would vote for them. I mean, it's, you know, there is a very, very strong element of partisan loyalty here.
Is there a parallel here in Britain where we saw in the Brexit referendum, someone like Nigel Farage was able to present himself as the opposite to the establishment? Do you think that we're seeing something happening either side of the Atlantic?
Oh, definitely. I think there's three interrelated issues. One is the foreign policy ramifications, particularly as it relates to the Middle East. Second is the fall of the economic policies, particularly following the 2007 recession, and the general collapse of traditional civil society. These three things are happening in both the United States and the UK. And so the very similar supporters that went for Brexit are voting for Trump.
And Hillary Clinton, very popular at one stage, and a remarkable decline in popularity. Is it just the whole email business?
I actually don't think she's in decline. I think if you look at the electoral map, she's very strong. I think I would be surprised if she gets anything under 288 electoral votes. The fundraising, she's up at least $500 million from Trump. The ground game, she has a superior ground game. I think she has 43 events in 12 states with 7 surrogates and 8 celebrities. Trump only has 23 events in 9 states and only 2 surrogates, one being his wife. So, and if you look at the early voting patterns in North Carolina, half of North Carolina has already voted, and she's already up 200,000 votes. So is she really in decline? I think the numbers suggest no.
It's been a terribly personal campaign. I suppose it's inevitable in presidential election. You've got two people, and it all gets terribly polarised. But it seems to have been tremendously personal and indeed very negative. One of the great reasons for voting for Trump if you don't want Hillary Clinton, or vote for Hillary Clinton if you don't want Trump. A little bit negative.
It's unusually so. American political campaigns at the federal level go on for a year and a half in the public sphere, and much more than that in terms of locking down major donors and operatives and the sort of the infrastructure you need to make a serious run for the presidency. So by the time you get to the last stretch, the part that, you know, the most of the world and the sort of the bulk of the American voting public tunes in for, the people in the middle of this have been doing this and have been sort of hammering away at each other for 12, 18, 24 months. And at that point, everybody is tired, everybody is stressed, and that brings out, I think, more than it would in a 3 or 4 or 6 month campaign, a lot of real negativity.
How long is it before that sort of political campaigning comes to Britain, do you think?
Isn't it already here? At least when I saw Brexit, it was clear. It was like, it's about the no vote. It's about the negative campaigning. Negative campaigning is very effective in getting the other side not to vote.
Does anybody come out of this election well, you actually think?
The short answer is no. I mean, I think it doesn't say particularly great things about the party structures. It doesn't say particularly great things about the sort of the way in which the candidates have framed the issues and the way that it's gone, as you say, into that negative space. It'll be hard to recover from.
I actually think there's two Bernie Sanders will come out victor if the Democrats control the Senate. He actually chairs the Finance Senate Committee. Also, marijuana smokers will benefit in a lot of the statewide propositions. There's a ballot proposal to legalize marijuana, and it looks like it's going to win. So I think marijuana and Bernie are going to be the victors of this election.
Now, 16 years ago, 2000, it was an inconclusive result, and the court decisions, the court rulings seemed to go on for weeks afterwards. A bit of a nightmare. It's not going to happen this time, is it?
We don't know. I mean, it very well might. Every campaign since 2000, both sides have put teams of lawyers into Florida, into some other states that are likely to be Nevada, North Carolina, states that are likely to be toss-ups in the event that it's close enough, and the margin for recount varies on a state-by-state basis. There hasn't been a margin that's been close enough that anyone's actually contested since Florida in 2000, but both sides are still geared up for that to happen.
But I think the worst fear is not the tie, it's voter intimidation, voter suppression. We already saw a black church that's gotten bombed, and there's graffiti that says, vote Trump. And so I think less than the worry, a scandal of the tie, it's a scandal of actual violence happening.
Thank you very much indeed. Jacob Parakilas and Daniel Cato, thanks for joining us on the programme. And you can watch BBC coverage of the US presidential election results on the News Channel on Tuesday night into Wednesday morning, while BBC Parliament will be linking up with our US sister channel C-SPAN and will be showing their results programme. The Home Secretary has said there will not be a public inquiry into the policing at the so-called Battle of Orgreave. The scenes of miners and police officers clashing at the coking works in South Yorkshire turned into the strongest images of the year-long miners' strike of 1984-5. Campaigners have long claimed that police officers used brutal tactics. Some miners faced charges of riot, charges that were subsequently dropped.
I have today issued a written ministerial statement setting out my decision. I have concluded that there is no case for either a statutory inquiry or an independent review.
This is an astonishing and frankly shameful decision by the government. The government have led those families up the garden path for the last 2 years.
We know the South Yorkshire Police lied about what happened at Hillsborough, yet only 5 years earlier, the same South Yorkshire Police, many of the same commanders, behaved in a very similar way at Orgreave. Yes. The Orgreave families and campaigners need the same justice as Hillsborough had. Yes. They need the same type of independent inquiry to establish the truth.
Yes. I would respectfully say to the Right Honourable Lady that the Hillsborough situation was quite different to Orgreave. 96 people died. It was right that we had an inquiry that analysed exactly what happened on the day. In this situation, in Orgreave, there were no miscarriages of justice. There were no deaths. There were no convictions. The Right Honourable Lady should be aware. Therefore, it doesn't merit the same level of status as a public inquiry as was required for Hillsborough.
And now a look at some of the other stories around Parliament in the last 7 days. The Culture Secretary, Karen Bradley, has said the government is to hold a consultation exercise before deciding if Part 2 of the Leveson inquiry goes ahead. Part 1 studied the ethical practices of newspapers. Part 2 is due to probe deeper into illegal phone hacking by newspaper journalists.
Given the extent of these criminal investigations, the implementation of the recommendations from Part 1 of the Leveson inquiry, and the cost to the taxpayer of the investigations in Part 1, which is £43.7 million and £5.4 million respectively, the government is considering whether undertaking Part 2 is still in the public interest.
She is today announcing a consultation on whether the cover-up should be covered up. And it's my view that the events of the past 5 years make Leveson 2 more urgent, not less.
Why doesn't she just do the right thing on behalf of the victims, commence the legislation that this House and the House of Lords have already passed, and do the right thing by the victims?
Will she bear in mind that the real media giants of today, like Facebook and Google, are outside the scope of legislation and regulation altogether?
Should higher education be worried by Brexit? Peers discuss the impact of Britain's EU departure on the nation's universities.
We have a world-class system of higher education which is admired around the world. The high status of our system is something we must preserve, and the decision to leave the EU is a potential threat to this.
On the Erasmus scheme, for every EU student coming to the UK, as you know, as a UK student can go out and experience career-changing developments and opportunities abroad. The university receives €1.7 million a year to facilitate this. This could be lost, which would be a great blow.
There are huge technological opportunities for universities and research in the world, particularly online, international campuses, things like that. We must grasp opportunities to explore these possibilities in a post-Brexit world.
Choking off the air we breathe after a damning court judgment on air quality calls in the Commons for all diesel vehicles to be removed from Britain's roads.
We need a scrappage scheme to get these filthy, belching diesel buses and cars off our towns and cities. We are choking and poisoning children. That's why we need action now.
We've done the analysis, and trying to just have one particular kind of scheme where any diesel car can be replaced would not be the best use of either taxpayers' money, because it's not a targeted intervention. I really want to be smart about this and use taxpayers' money effectively so that we can tackle this issue, not just have a comprehensive scrappage scheme.
Could these be the answer to illegal drones? Eagles are in use in Holland to tackle the hazard. Dutch police have been conducting tests and say the birds are not in any danger. Could this idea fly?
Can smuggling into prisons by drones be stopped?
The new threat by drones is a game changer, not just for prisons, but other parts of government. That is why I'm working with ministers across the government to engage with drone manufacturers to find a solution to this problem. I'm keeping a close eye on what is happening internationally, particularly in Holland, where they're using eagles to stop drones. And I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, we will find a solution in the UK that will take off.
It was 13 years ago, but the Iraq War comes in for yet more discussion in Parliament when the man who led the inquiry into the war faces a committee of MPs.
Was it reasonable for Tony Blair, at that time that he made that statement, to suppose that there was an imminent threat?
If you're posing that question with regard to a statement of an imminent threat to the United Kingdom,
I am.
Then in that case, I have to say, no, there was not sufficient evidence to sustain that belief objectively at the time.
It's not a question of whether it was more qualified. This is a test. It's a test of would a reasonable man conclude that this evidence supported going to war?
If I may say so, Chairman, that seems to me an easier question for me to answer, because the answer to that is no.
And remembering Jo Cox, her recently elected successor in West Yorkshire makes her maiden speech in the Commons.
We will never forget the difference Jo has made, and through her legacy continues to make. She was and is unforgettable. I make this speech during a debate on policing. So I wish, Mr. Speaker, to finish with a tribute to the brave officers of West Yorkshire Police, who reacted so swiftly and professionally on that awful day in June. A community that could have become overrun with panic with such a terrible act taking place in broad daylight in the sleepy village I grew up in was looked after admirably by our police.
Tracy Brabin. And that's it for this programme. Just a short week coming up, with the Lords and the Commons taking a couple of days half-term. But before that, there'll be a debate on Monday on that High Court judgment on Brexit. So do join me for the next Week in Parliament. Until then, from me, Keith McDougall, goodbye.